The blood had dried on Emma Rollins' shirtwaist 3 days ago, but the pain in her ribs felt fresh as a brand every time she tried to lie down flat. She sat propped against the wall of the Steins Pass Mercantile at 2 in the morning, her head lolling forward in exhausted sleep, while her body screamed for the relief that horizontal rest would bring. The stagecoach accident that had thrown her against a boulder had left her with injuries the town doctor said would heal. But healing took time she didn't have when every night brought another battle against gravity and agony. Henry Zimmerman had been watching her for 2 days now, ever since he'd ridden into this dusty New Mexico town in late August of 1883 with nothing but his horse, his tools, and a reputation for building the finest furniture between Santa Fe and Tucson. He'd seen plenty of suffering in his 32 years, had watched his own mother waste away from consumption when he was barely old enough to understand death. But something about the young woman's quiet determination struck him differently. She never complained, never asked for help, just sat there in the corner of the boarding house dining room each evening, her back rigid against the wall, her green eyes clouded with exhaustion. He'd asked the boarding house keeper about her that second morning over bitter coffee and cornbread. Mrs. Patterson had told him the whole sorry tale while scrubbing dishes with enough force to crack porcelain. Emma Rollins was 24, had been coming to Steins Pass to take a teaching position at the new schoolhouse when the stage had overturned on the Apache Pass Road. The driver had died instantly, his neck broken clean. Emma had been lucky, the doctor said, just 3 cracked ribs and some deep bruising, but lying flat compressed something inside that made breathing nearly impossible. She'd spent the first night after the accident trying to sleep in bed, only to wake gasping and clawing at the sheets like she was drowning in air. Since then, she'd been sleeping sitting up or trying to. Mrs. Patterson had given her extra pillows, tried propping her up in bed, but nothing worked quite right. The pillows slipped, her body slumped, and every time she jerked awake the movement sent fresh pain lancing through her torso. The schoolhouse board was already talking about finding another teacher, someone who could actually stand at a chalkboard for 8 hours without looking like they might collapse. Henry had worked with wood since he was 10 years old, learning the trade from a German carpenter in St. Louis who taught him that furniture wasn't just about function. It was about understanding the human body and all its particular needs. He'd built rocking chairs for nursing mothers, special stools for cobblers with bad backs, even a modified desk for a clerk with only one arm. His mind had already been turning over the problem of Emma Rollins and her sleepless nights, measuring angles and calculating weight distribution. On the 3rd morning, he approached her at breakfast. She was sitting at the table instead of against the wall, trying to eat scrambled eggs without bending forward too far. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a braid that had started neat, but now showed the fraying of too many difficult nights. She had a fine-boned face with a determined chin, and despite the purple shadows under her eyes, Henry could see the kind of beauty that came from strength rather than simple prettiness. "Miss Rollins," he said, removing his hat. "My name is Henry Zimmerman. I'm a carpenter. I wonder if you might allow me to build you something that could help with your situation." She looked up at him with those tired green eyes, and he saw wariness there, the kind that came from too many people offering empty sympathy. "That's kind of you, Mr. Zimmerman, but I don't have money for furniture. The school board is paying for my room and board, but that's all." "I'm not asking for payment," Henry said. "I'm asking for the challenge. I've never built a chair for someone who needs to sleep sitting up, and I'd like to try. If it doesn't work, you've lost nothing but the time it takes me to build it. If it does work, well, you might get a decent night's rest." Emma studied him for a long moment. He was a tall man, lean and strong in the way of men who made their living with their hands. His dark hair needed cutting and his jaw needed shaving, but his eyes were kind and direct, no hidden motives lurking in their brown depths. She'd learned to read men quickly during her years teaching in rough mining towns, had to learn who to trust and who to keep at arm's length. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally. "You don't know me." Henry pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, though he kept a respectful distance. "My mother spent the last 6 months of her life unable to lie down flat, fluid in her lungs. She'd sit in a hard back chair all night, sometimes managing an hour or two of sleep. I was just a boy then, didn't know enough to help her. But I know enough now, and I have the skills to do something about it, so if you'll let me, I'd like to try." The raw honesty in his voice made Emma's throat tighten. She'd been holding herself together through sheer will for 3 days, refusing to let anyone see how close she was to breaking. The nights were endless, each minute stretching into hours as she fought to find a position that didn't hurt, that would let her body rest even a little. She'd doze off for 20 minutes at a time, only to wake with her neck cramped and her back screaming. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Henry felt something shift in his chest at her acceptance, though he couldn't have named what it was. "I'll need to take some measurements if that's acceptable. Nothing improper, just your height and the length of your back, that sort of thing. Mrs. Patterson can chaperone." Emma nodded, and they arranged to meet that afternoon in the boarding house parlor. Henry spent the morning in his rented room sketching designs, figuring angles and mechanisms. He'd brought his best tools with him from his last job in Silver City, and he knew the mercantile stocked decent lumber, though he'd have to be selective about what he chose. The chair needed to be strong enough to support a sleeping person, but light enough to move easily. It needed to recline but also lock into position. It needed to cradle the body without putting pressure on injured ribs. The more he thought about it, the more invested he became in solving this puzzle. He'd always loved the challenge of custom work, the way each piece required him to think differently, to innovate. This chair would be his masterpiece, he decided. Something that would demonstrate his skill better than any parlor set or dining table ever could. That afternoon, Emma stood stiffly in the boarding house parlor while Henry measured her height against a marked stick, noted the length from her neck to her lower back, estimated the width of her shoulders. Mrs. Patterson watched from her rocking chair, knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm. Henry kept his touch professional and brief, but even so, he couldn't help noticing the warmth of Emma's skin through her sleeve when he positioned her arm to measure the proper height for armrests, or the faint scent of lavender soap she used despite being 3 days into wearing the same dress, because raising her arms to change was too painful. "The key is going to be the angle," he explained as he worked, partly to her and partly to himself. "Too steep and you'll slide down. Not steep enough and you might as well be sitting straight up. I'm thinking about 45 degrees for sleeping, but with a mechanism that lets you adjust it for sitting and reading during the day." "That sounds complicated," Emma said. "It is complicated," Henry agreed, "but complicated is interesting. I'll need about a week to build it properly." "Can you manage until then?" Emma's face showed her exhaustion clearly. "I'll have to. I don't have much choice." "You could always give up the teaching position and go back home," Mrs. Patterson offered, not unkindly. "Your family must be worried sick about you." Something flickered across Emma's face, there and gone too quickly for Henry to interpret. "I don't have family to go back to. My parents died 4 years ago, fever. I've been teaching in mining camps and small towns ever since. This position in Stein's Pass is the most stable opportunity I've had. I'm not giving it up." The steel in her voice told Henry there was more to that story, but he didn't pry. Instead, he finished his measurements and promised to update her on his progress. That evening, after a supper of beef stew and hard biscuits, he walked to the mercantile and spent an hour selecting lumber. He chose pine for most of it, light but sturdy, and splurged on a bit of oak for the frame's stress points. The mercantile owner, a wizened man named Horace who'd lived in Stein's Pass since it was just a stage station, watched him with interest. "Building something special?" Horace asked. "A chair," Henry said, running his hand over a plank to check for warping. "For Miss Rollins. She needs something she can sleep in until her ribs heal." Horace's expression softened. "That's a kind thing you're doing. She's a good woman, that one. Came through here 2 weeks back on her way to scout out the town before taking the job. Sat right over there talking to my wife about books and teaching for near 2 hours. Smart as a whip and twice as determined." Henry paid for his lumber and carried it back to the boarding house, where Mrs. Patterson had agreed to let him use a corner of the stable for his workshop. He spent that evening cutting pieces and sanding them smooth, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of creation. The stable was quiet except for the occasional stamp of hooves and the rustle of horses settling in for the night. He worked by lantern light, his hands moving with practiced confidence. He didn't see Emma again until the next morning at breakfast, but he was aware of her presence in the boarding house, aware that somewhere above him she was sitting awake through another long night. It created an odd sense of connection, knowing they were both awake in the dark hours, him working on the solution to her problem while she endured it. The chair began to take shape over the next few days. Henry built the frame first. Mortise and tenon joints fitted so precisely they needed no nails, though he used them anyway for extra strength. The base needed to be wide and stable, capable of supporting the chair at various angles without tipping. He designed a simple ratchet system using notched boards and a locking pin that would allow Emma to adjust the recline angle herself. On the fourth day, Emma came to watch him work. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the stable's open doors in golden bars of light. Henry looked up from sanding an armrest to find her standing in the doorway, one hand pressed lightly to her side. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I was going stir-crazy in my room." "I don't mind at all," Henry said, brushing sawdust from his hands, "though there's not much to see yet. Just pieces and parts." Emma moved closer, studying the components laid out on his workbench. "It's more than I could make. I can barely sew a straight line, let alone build furniture." "Everyone has different skills," Henry said. "I couldn't teach a room full of children if my life depended on it. I don't have the patience." "You'd be surprised what you can do when it's necessary," Emma said. She reached out and ran her fingers along the smooth curve of an armrest. "This is beautiful work. The wood is so smooth." "Has to be," Henry said, watching her touch his work and feeling an unexpected pleasure at her appreciation. "Splinters would be the last thing you need while trying to sleep." Emma smiled, a real smile for the first time since he'd met her, and Henry felt his breath catch slightly. When she wasn't tight with pain and exhaustion, she was genuinely lovely, with a warmth that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside her. "Tell me about teaching," he said, picking up his sandpaper again, needing something to do with his hands. "What made you choose it?" Emma lowered herself carefully onto an overturned crate, settling into a position that seemed to minimize her discomfort. "I didn't have many options after my parents died. We'd never had much money, and what little they left went to paying debts. But I'd had good teachers myself, and I loved books, loved learning. A friend of my mother's helped me get a position in a mining camp in Colorado. I was 20 then, terrified out of my mind. The children were wild and the miners were rough, but I managed. Found out I was good at it, good at reaching children who never had much reason to care about reading or arithmetic. That must have been difficult, Henry said. A young woman alone in a mining camp. It was, Emma admitted, but it was also freeing in a way. No one to tell me what I should or shouldn't do. No one to worry about my reputation or my prospects, just me and the work. Henry heard what she didn't say, the loneliness beneath the pride. Is that why you came to Stein's Pass? For more of the same freedom? Emma was quiet for a moment, watching him work. I came to Stein's Pass because I'm tired, she said finally. Tired of moving from place to place every year or two. Tired of temporary positions and temporary homes. The school board here offered me a 3-year contract. A chance to actually settle somewhere, to build something lasting. I know it's just a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, but it's more stability than I've had in years. The vulnerability in her voice made Henry look up from his work. Their eyes met across the dusty stable, and he saw in her face the same thing he felt in himself, the bone-deep weariness of always being adrift, always temporary. I understand that, he said quietly. I've been moving town to town for 8 years now. Build some furniture, make some money, move on when the work dries up. I keep thinking someday I'll find a place worth staying in, but it hasn't happened yet. Maybe we're both just restless by nature, Emma said. Maybe, Henry agreed. Or maybe we just haven't found the right reason to stop. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of shared experience, of parallel lonely paths. Emma felt it like a warmth in her chest, different from the constant ache of her ribs, and Henry felt it like a pull towards something he hadn't known he was looking for. Over the next few days, Emma's afternoon visits to the stable became routine. She would sit on her crate and talk while Henry worked, telling him stories about her students and her travels. He learned that she'd taught children in 7 different towns, that she could speak passable Spanish and read Latin, that she had a particular fondness for mathematics, which most people found odd in a woman. He told her about learning carpentry, about the careful joy of taking raw lumber and transforming it into something beautiful and useful, about the German carpenter, who'd been more of a father to him than his own father ever was. They discovered they were both readers, both hungry for books in a way that went beyond simple entertainment. Emma had carried the same 6 books with her from town to town for 4 years, reading them over and over because she couldn't afford new ones. Henry admitted he'd once traded 2 days of labor for a battered copy of Ivanhoe and considered it the best deal he'd ever made. I'll lend you some of mine, Emma offered. If you'd like. I have Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, some Hawthorne, a collection of Tennyson's poetry. I'd like that very much, Henry said, and meant it more than was probably reasonable for simple book lending. The chair was nearly complete by the 6th day. Henry had fashioned a thick cushion for the seat and back, stuffed with horsehair he'd bought from the livery and covered with sturdy canvas. The armrests were wide and comfortable, perfect for resting a book or folded hands. The ratchet mechanism worked smoothly, allowing the back to lock at several different angles. He'd even carved a small decorative detail into the headrest, a simple pattern of leaves and vines because he couldn't help himself, couldn't give her something purely functional when he could make it beautiful too. Emma watched him apply the final coat of linseed oil, her expression unreadable. It's too fine, she said finally. Too much work for something temporary. Who says it's temporary? Henry asked. Even after your ribs heal, you'll have a good chair. You can use it for reading, for sitting outside in the evenings. It doesn't stop being useful just because the emergency has passed. I can't pay you for this, Emma said, and there was distress in her voice. This is worth real money, and I have almost nothing. Henry set down his oil rag and looked at her directly. "Emma, I told you from the start I wasn't asking for payment. I built this because I wanted to, because I could. Let that be enough." "But why?" Emma asked, and her voice broke slightly on the question. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Henry could have given her the same answer he'd given at the start, about his mother and the challenge of the work. But standing there in the stable with sawdust motes dancing in the afternoon light, and this brave, tired woman looking at him with eyes that held too much loneliness, he found himself telling the truth. "Because the first time I saw you sleeping propped against that wall, I thought you looked like the loneliest person I'd ever seen," he said. "And I've been lonely enough myself to recognize it. So maybe this chair is as much for me as it is for you. Maybe it helps me to help you. Maybe that makes me selfish, but there it is." Emma's eyes filled with tears, the first time he'd seen her cry. She blinked them back fiercely, but one escaped, tracking down her cheek. "That's not selfish," she whispered. "That's the kindest thing anyone has done for me in longer than I can remember." Henry wanted to close the distance between them, wanted to touch her face and wipe away that tear, but he held himself back. It was too soon, too much, and she was injured and vulnerable. Instead, he just nodded and said, "Let me carry this up to your room so you can try it tonight." Mrs. Patterson helped them maneuver the chair up the narrow stairs to Emma's room, which was small but clean, with a single window overlooking the main street. Henry positioned the chair next to the bed and showed Emma how the adjustment mechanism worked, demonstrating the different angles. "Start with the most upright position tonight," he advised. "Your body needs time to adjust to lying flatter. Each night you can try reclining a little more until you work up to the full angle, and if anything hurts, go back to a steeper position. There's no rush." Emma sat down in the chair carefully, and Henry watched her face as her body settled against the cushions he'd made. The relief that washed over her features was immediate and profound. The angle supported her back perfectly while taking all pressure off her ribs. The armrests were exactly the right height. The headrest cradled her skull gently. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, this is wonderful." "Try the reclining function," Henry said, his voice rougher than he intended because seeing her relief affected him more than it should have. Emma pulled the pin and carefully lowered the back one notch. Even at that slight angle, still mostly upright, the difference from sitting against a wall was dramatic. Her whole body seemed to relax into the support of the chair. "I might actually sleep tonight," she said, looking up at Henry with wonder in her eyes. "I might actually rest." "That was the idea," Henry said, smiling. "I'll check on you tomorrow, see if anything needs adjusting." He left her there, sitting in the chair with her eyes already drifting closed, and felt a satisfaction deeper than any he'd ever gotten from completing a job. Mrs. Patterson caught his arm on the way down the stairs. "That was a fine thing you did," she said. "And I know what I see when I look at the two of you. Just be careful with her, Henry. She's been hurt enough." "I know," Henry said. "I will be." That night, Henry lay in his own bed in the room he rented from Mrs. Patterson and found himself listening to the silence above him, imagining Emma finally sleeping comfortably. The thought made him feel warm and settled in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd been drifting for so long, taking jobs where he found them, never forming real connections, never letting himself want anything permanent. But Emma Rollins, with her tired eyes and fierce determination, had worked her way under his skin in less than a week. The next morning, Emma appeared at breakfast looking transformed. The shadows under her eyes had lightened, and there was color in her cheeks. She moved more carefully than he supposed she had before the accident, but the tightness of constant pain had eased from her shoulders. "I slept 5 hours," she told Henry, her voice full of amazed gratitude. 5 hours straight without waking. I forgot what that felt like." "I'm glad," Henry said, and found he couldn't stop grinning. "Any adjustments needed?" "None," Emma said. "It's perfect." "You're a miracle worker, Henry Zimmerman." Over the next week, Emma continued to heal. Each night she reclined the chair a little more, following Henry's advice to let her body adjust gradually. The school board, seeing that she was recovering, confirmed her position would begin in 3 weeks when the fall term started. She spent her days preparing lesson plans and her evenings sitting outside the boarding house with Henry, talking about everything and nothing. They fell into an easy companionship that surprised them both with its depth. Henry found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about his difficult childhood with a father who drank and a mother who tried to shield him from it, about the relief he'd felt when he'd left home at 16 with nothing but his tools and his determination. Emma told him about her parents' gentle poverty, about growing up in a house full of love but empty of anything extra, about the shame she'd felt when she couldn't afford to keep their small home after they died. "I felt like I'd failed them," she admitted one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "They'd sacrificed so much to make sure I had an education, and then I couldn't even hold onto the one thing they'd left me." "You were 20 years old and alone," Henry said firmly. "You did the best you could with what you had. That's all anyone can do." Emma looked at him, this man who'd appeared in her life at her lowest moment and given her not just a chair but kindness without expectation. "How did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise," Henry said. "I've just made enough mistakes to recognize them, and holding yourself responsible for things beyond your control is one I've made plenty of times." As August faded into September, Henry found himself inventing reasons to stay in Stein's Pass. He took a job building new shelves for the mercantile. He agreed to repair the church pews. He told himself it was just because the work was available, but he knew the truth. He was staying for Emma. Emma knew it too, though neither of them spoke it aloud. She watched him work on the church pews one afternoon, his hands sure and steady as he fitted new boards, and felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. She'd spent 4 years keeping herself carefully separate from any emotional entanglement, knowing that her transient life made relationships impossible. But Henry made her want things she'd stopped letting herself want: stability and partnership, and someone to share the burden of being alone. 2 weeks after the chair was complete, Emma's ribs had healed enough that she could lie flat in bed without pain. She tried it one night, expecting to feel relief at returning to normal sleep. Instead, she found herself missing the chair, missing the specific comfort Henry had built into every joint and angle. She got up and moved to the chair instead, reclining it fully flat for the first time, and fell asleep feeling held by something more than just wood and cushions. The next morning she found Henry at the church and told him about her experiment. "I think I've become attached to the chair," she said, trying to make it light. "I may never sleep in a bed again." "The chair was meant to be used," Henry said. "I'm glad it's still serving you well." They looked at each other in the dusty sunlight streaming through the church windows, and Emma felt the moment stretch and deepen into something significant. Henry felt it too, this pull between them that had been growing stronger every day. "Emma," he started, then stopped, unsure how to put words to what he was feeling. "Yes?" she asked, her heart beating faster. Before Henry could answer, the church door banged open and Horace from the mercantile hurried in, his weathered face creased with concern. "Henry, Emma, you need to come quick. There's been an Apache raid on a ranch north of here. They're bringing in wounded." The moment shattered. Henry and Emma followed Horace out into a town suddenly full of urgent activity. A wagon was pulling up in front of the doctor's office. carrying 3 men with gunshot wounds and a woman with an arrow through her shoulder. The doctor, a harried man in his 50s named Crawford, was already shouting for help. Henry had some experience with injuries from his years on the frontier, and Emma had nursed sick students and miners through various ailments. They both jumped in to help without being asked. The next several hours passed in a blur of boiling water, tearing sheets for bandages, and holding down screaming men while Dr. Crawford dug out bullets. The woman with the arrow was the worst case. Crawford needed someone with steady hands to help him push the arrow through and out rather than trying to pull it back through. Henry held the woman still while Emma, her face pale but determined, helped Crawford complete the agonizing procedure. The woman fainted halfway through, which was a mercy. By evening, all 4 patients were stabilized. 2 of the men would recover fully. The third had lost enough blood that Crawford wasn't sure, and the woman would survive but might never have full use of her arm again. Henry and Emma stumbled out of the doctor's office exhausted and splattered with other people's blood. "I need to wash," Emma said faintly, looking down at her ruined dress. "Me too," Henry said. His shirt was beyond saving. They walked back to the boarding house in the gathering dusk, the adrenaline of the emergency fading into shaky fatigue. Mrs. Patterson took one look at them and immediately heated water for baths, fed them cold chicken and bread, and sent them to their respective rooms without asking questions. Henry stripped off his ruined clothes and washed in the basin, scrubbing away blood and the smell of fear sweat from the wounded. His hands were shaking slightly, aftermath of the tension. He'd seen violence before, had even been shot at once during a land dispute in Colorado, but it never got easier watching people suffer. He thought about Emma's face as she'd helped with the arrow, the way she'd forced herself to stay calm and focused even though her hands had been trembling. She had more courage than most men he knew, and the realization of just how much he admired her hit him like a physical force. He was in love with her. Somehow, in 2 weeks, this woman had become essential to him. The thought terrified him and thrilled him in equal measure. In her room above him, Emma was having similar revelations as she washed blood from her hands and arms. Watching Henry today, seeing his competence and compassion, the way he'd been gentle with the wounded while still doing what needed to be done, had shown her a depth to him that went beyond kindness or skill. He was a good man, genuinely good in a way that was rare, and she'd fallen in love with him without meaning to, without planning for it. The question was what to do about it. Her teaching contract started in a week. Henry had no ties to Stein's Pass beyond the temporary work he'd taken. They were both wanderers by necessity and habit, and love didn't change the practical realities of their lives. Or did it? Emma sat in her chair, reclining it to a comfortable angle, and let herself think about possibilities. What if Henry stayed? What if she asked him to? Stein's Pass was growing, needing new houses and furniture. A skilled carpenter could make a good living here. They could build a life together, something permanent and real. The hope scared her more than anything had in years. The next morning, Emma came down to breakfast determined to find Henry and have an honest conversation about feelings and futures. Instead, she found Mrs. Patterson red-eyed at the stove and a stranger sitting at the table, a well-dressed man with a badge that read Deputy U.S. Marshal. "What's happened?" Emma asked, fear immediate and cold. "It's Henry," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice thick. "He's gone." "Gone?" Emma repeated stupidly. "What do you mean gone?" The marshal stood and introduced himself as Thomas Wade. "Mr. Zimmerman left before dawn this morning, miss. He asked me to give you this." He held out a folded piece of paper. Emma took it with numb fingers and read Henry's careful script. "Emma, by the time you read this, I'll be gone." The marshal brought word last night that there's been trouble at a ranch where I worked last year. Legal trouble involving disputed ownership, and my testimony is needed. I have to go, and I don't know when I'll be back. Could be weeks, could be months. I'm sorry to leave like this. Sorry I didn't get to say goodbye properly. You start teaching soon and you'll be wonderful at it. Those children are lucky to have you. The chair is yours, of course. Take care of yourself. Emma read it twice, looking for something between the lines, some indication of the feelings she'd been so sure they shared. But the letter was friendly and nothing more, polite and distant. She felt something crack inside her chest. Did he say anything else? She asked the marshal, hating how her voice shook. Just that he needed to leave immediately, Wade said, not unkindly. I'm sorry, miss. I know the timing is poor. Emma folded the letter carefully and tucked it in her pocket. Thank you for delivering it. She turned to Mrs. Patterson. I'm not hungry. I think I'll go for a walk. She left before either of them could respond, walking out into the cool September morning without direction or purpose. She ended up at the church, sitting in a pew Henry had repaired, running her hands over what he'd touched. The hurt was enormous and confusing, grief and embarrassment and anger all tangled together. She'd been a fool. She'd let herself believe in something that wasn't real, had read too much into simple kindness. Henry had built her a chair because he was a good man who saw someone suffering, nothing more. The friendship they'd developed had been real, but that was all it was. She'd invented the rest, projected her own feelings onto him. Emma sat in the empty church and let herself cry, hard, wrenching sobs that hurt her still healing ribs. She cried for her loneliness and her stupid hope, for the future she'd imagined that would never exist, for the loss of something she'd never actually had. When the tears finally stopped, she felt emptied out and exhausted. But underneath the hurt was something harder, the same determination that had kept her moving forward after her parents died, after every other disappointment and setback. She would survive this too. She would teach her students and build her new life in Stein's Pass, and eventually the ache of Henry Zimmerman would fade to a dull memory. The school term started the following Monday. Emma threw herself into teaching with fierce focus, determined to prove she was worth the school board's faith in her. She had 17 students ranging from age 6 to 14, children of ranchers and shopkeepers and railroad workers. They were rough and rowdy and wonderful, and Emma found she could lose herself in the work of shaping young minds. The chair stayed in her room, and she continued to sleep in it even though she no longer needed to. It was comfortable and familiar, and some stubborn part of her refused to give up the one tangible thing Henry had left her. September turned to October. The air grew cooler, and the leaves on the few cottonwoods along the creek turned gold. Emma developed routines and friendships, becoming part of the town's fabric. She had supper with Mrs. Patterson and joined the church social committee. She organized a spelling bee that became the most exciting event Stein's Pass had seen in months. She didn't let herself think about Henry, or at least she tried not to. But every time she sat in the chair, every time she passed the stable where he'd built it, she felt the echo of what might have been. 6 weeks after Henry left, Emma was walking home from school when she saw a familiar figure standing outside the boarding house. For a moment, her heart stopped entirely. Then the figure turned and she saw it wasn't Henry at all, just a tall man with dark hair who resembled him only in the most general way. The disappointment was crushing, and Emma realized she'd been lying to herself. She hadn't gotten over Henry at all. She'd just gotten better at ignoring the hurt. That night, she sat in her chair and reread his letter for the 100th time, looking for clues she'd missed. The words remained stubbornly neutral, friendly but distant. Except there at the end, Take care of yourself. Not take care, but take care of yourself, as though he wanted to be the one taking care of her but couldn't. Or was she reading too much into it again, seeing what she wanted to see? Emma didn't know, and not knowing was its own special torture. October faded into November. The first real cold snap hit, and Emma wore her shawl to school every day, keeping the stove burning to warm her students. She was teaching them long division and reading them the last of the Mohicans a chapter at a time. And the work was rewarding enough that she sometimes went whole hours without thinking of Henry. Then, on a gray November morning with the smell of snow in the air, Emma was helping one of her younger students with his letters when someone knocked on the schoolhouse door. She looked up, expecting a parent, and found Henry Zimmerman standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Emma's heart lurched so violently she thought for a moment she might be sick. He looked thinner than she remembered, tired in a bone-deep way, and there was something in his eyes she couldn't read. "Miss Rollins," he said formally, aware of 17 pairs of curious eyes on them. "I apologize for interrupting. Might I speak with you when you have a moment?" Emma's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Children, please copy the next page in your primers. I'll be just outside." She stepped out onto the schoolhouse porch and closed the door behind her, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. Henry stood a few feet away, and the distance between them felt immense. "Hello, Emma," he said quietly. "Hello, Henry." Emma forced herself to meet his eyes. "I didn't know you were back. I got in last night. Late. I went to the boarding house this morning and Mrs. Patterson told me you'd be here." They stood in awkward silence. Emma didn't know what to say, didn't know what he wanted from this conversation. "The legal matter took longer than I thought," Henry said finally. "There were complications. And then on my way back here I took a detour." "Oh." Emma's voice was carefully neutral. "I went to Kansas City. There's a furniture maker there I did an apprenticeship with years ago. I wrote to him from Texas, where the legal matter was, and asked if his offer for a partnership was still open." Emma felt something sink inside her. "And was it?" "It was," Henry said. "A generous offer. Good workshop, established reputation, guaranteed income. Everything a sensible man would want." "Then congratulations," Emma made herself say. "I'm happy for you." "I turned it down," Henry said, and Emma's carefully maintained composure cracked. "What? Why?" Henry took a step closer. "Because I realized somewhere between Texas and Kansas City that I didn't want a partnership in a furniture shop. I wanted to build a life in a little New Mexico town with a school teacher who sleeps in the chair I made her." Emma stared at him, afraid to believe what she was hearing. "Henry." "I should have said something before I left," Henry continued, words spilling out in a rush. "I should have told you that I'd fallen in love with you, that leaving was the hardest thing I'd ever done. But I was scared. Scared you didn't feel the same way, scared I'd ruin the friendship we had. So I left like a coward, and I've regretted it every day since." "You love me," Emma whispered. "So much it terrifies me," Henry said. "You're the reason I want to stop wandering, Emma. You're the reason I came back to Stein's Pass instead of taking that partnership. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after the way I left, but if there's any chance you might feel the same way, I'm here. I want to stay here, build a business here, build a life here. With you, if you'll have me." Emma felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling, a huge, helpless smile. "You idiot," she said, half laughing, half crying. "Of course I feel the same way. I've been miserable for 2 months." Henry's face transformed with hope and relief. "Really, really," Emma said. "I fell in love with you while you were building that chair, watching you work, listening to you talk. And when you left I thought I'd been a fool, thought I'd imagined what we had." "You didn't imagine it," Henry said fervently. "It was real. It is real." They stood looking at each other, and then Henry closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. Emma wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his shoulder, feeling him solid and real and here. They held each other tightly, two lonely people who'd found home in each other. "I have 17 students watching through the window," Emma murmured eventually. "I don't care," Henry said, but he loosened his hold enough to look at her face. "Emma Rollins, I'm going to court you properly. I'm going to build a carpentry shop and make furniture and make myself a permanent part of this town. And when enough time has passed that it's respectable, I'm going to ask you to marry me, just so you know." "That's quite a plan," Emma said, still smiling through her tears. "Is it a good plan?" Henry asked, suddenly uncertain again. "It's a perfect plan," Emma said. "Though for the record, I don't care much about respectable timing. I've been on my own too long to worry about what people think." "Your reputation matters," Henry insisted. "You're a teacher." "I won't do anything to jeopardize your position." Emma touched his face gently. "Then we'll court properly. But Henry, I already know what my answer will be when you ask." The joy in his eyes was enough to warm her through despite the November cold. He kissed her forehead, chaste and sweet, then stepped back. "Go teach your students. I'll see you after school." "Yes," Emma said. "I'll meet you at the boarding house." She watched him walk away, still hardly believing he was real, that this was happening. Then she went back inside to face 17 extremely curious children. "Who was that, Miss Rollins?" asked Sarah, one of her boldest students. "A friend," Emma said, then smiled. "A very good friend." The children giggled and whispered among themselves, but Emma just laughed and returned to their lessons, her heart lighter than it had been in months. True to his word, Henry courted Emma properly over the next months. He rented a small building on Steins Pass's Main Street and set up a proper carpentry shop. Word of his skills spread quickly, and soon he had more commissions than he could handle. Everything from kitchen tables to rocking chairs to an elaborate headboard for the hotel's best room. He and Emma were seen together often, walking after church on Sundays, having supper at the boarding house, sitting on Mrs. Patterson's porch in the evenings when the weather was mild enough. The town watched their courtship with approval and interest, happy to see two lonely people finding each other. Emma's teaching continued to thrive. She developed a reputation for being strict but fair, demanding much of her students but also genuinely caring about their progress. Parents who'd been skeptical of a young woman teacher became her strongest supporters. Winter came, cold and occasionally snowy. Henry built Emma a small bookshelf for her room and presented it to her at Christmas, along with 3 new books he'd ordered from Santa Fe. Emma gave him a thick wool scarf she'd knitted herself, the stitches not quite even but serviceable, and a copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass she'd saved up to buy. "I've never had a better Christmas," Henry told her as they sat in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, the older woman chaperoning while pretending to doze in her chair. "Neither have I," Emma said truthfully. The small gifts mattered less than the fact that she had someone to exchange gifts with, someone who thought about what she'd like and made the effort to provide it. In January, Henry bought a small plot of land at the edge of town and began building a house. It was modest but well designed, with 2 bedrooms and a good-sized main room, a separate kitchen and a workshop out back. Emma watched it go up over the weeks and months, understanding without words that he was building it for them, for the future he'd promised. In March, with the house nearly complete and spring beginning to green the desert, Henry asked Emma to marry him. He did it simply, after church on a Sunday, taking her hand as they walked and pulling a ring from his pocket. "I know we agreed to wait for respectable timing," he said, "but I've waited long enough to start my life with you. Emma Rollins, will you marry me?" The ring was silver with a small amber stone, and Emma loved it immediately. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." They were married 4 weeks later in the same church where Henry had repaired the pews. Emma wore a new dress, pale blue calico that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew. Henry wore a suit he'd bought in El Paso specifically for the occasion. Half the town attended, cramming into the small church to witness the union. Dr. Crawford gave Emma away, having appointed himself a sort of protective uncle since he'd treated her ribs. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears throughout the ceremony. Horace from the Mercantile and his wife hosted a reception with cake and punch. But the moment Emma would remember most clearly was standing next to Henry, his hand warm and solid around hers, listening to him promise to love and cherish her for all the days of his life. When he kissed her as husband and wife, she felt something settle deep in her soul, the restless, wandering energy finally finding peace. They moved into the new house that night, and Emma walked through rooms Henry had built with her in mind, seeing the way he'd placed windows to catch light, the way he'd designed the kitchen for efficient work, the beautiful simplicity of his craftsmanship. In the larger bedroom, positioned perfectly beside the window, was the chair. Henry had carried it from the boarding house and placed it in their new home. "I thought you might still want it," he said, watching her face, "even though you don't need it anymore." Emma ran her hand over the armrest, remembering those early days when this chair had represented the first real kindness anyone had shown her in years. "I'll always want it," she said. "It's where we started." Henry pulled her close. "No," he said. "We started with you sitting against a wall in pain, and me watching and wanting to help. The chair was just how I learned to love you." Emma kissed him then, deep and thorough, and he lifted her and carried her to the bed he'd built, the one piece of furniture in the room besides the chair. They made love for the first time as husband and wife, tender and slightly awkward and wonderful, and afterward Emma lay in Henry's arms and felt completely, perfectly content. Their life together developed its own rhythms over the next months and years. Emma taught during the school term and spent summers reading and helping in Henry's workshop. Henry built furniture and took on the occasional construction job, slowly becoming essential to Stein's Pass's growth. They hosted Sunday dinners for friends, attended town meetings, became the kind of established couple that younger people looked to as an example. In the evenings, they would often sit together in their main room, Emma in her special chair reading aloud while Henry worked on small carving projects. He never tired of seeing her in the chair he'd built, and she never stopped feeling grateful for the skill and care he'd put into making something specifically for her needs. 18 months into their marriage, Emma discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. Henry immediately began building a cradle, channeling his nervous energy into creating something perfect for their coming child. Emma continued teaching until 2 months before the baby was due, then reluctantly handed her classroom over to a temporary replacement. Their son was born on a sweltering July evening in 1885, with Dr. Crawford attending and Mrs. Patterson helping. Emma labored for 14 hours, and there were moments when Henry, pacing outside the bedroom door, thought he might lose his mind from helplessness and fear. But finally, he heard the thin wail of a newborn, and Crawford called him inside. Emma was exhausted and sweaty and more beautiful than Henry had ever seen her, holding a tiny red-faced infant against her chest. "We have a son," she said, smiling up at Henry with tears in her eyes. They named him James after Emma's father, and he was a good baby, healthy and growing strong. Emma took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything, learning as she went, asking advice from the town's more experienced mothers. Henry was a devoted father, getting up for nighttime feedings, walking the floor with James when he was fussy, building a special changing table and a toy box and a high chair. Emma watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again, seeing new dimensions to his kindness and patience. Henry watched Emma nursing their child and felt his heart expand beyond what he'd thought possible. The chair proved useful again during those early months. Emma discovered that the reclining position was perfect for nursing James, supporting her back and arms while she fed him. The chair that had been built to help her sleep through pain became the chair where she nurtured new life, and the poetry of that wasn't lost on either of them. Emma returned to teaching when James was 6 months old, hiring a young woman from one of the ranches to watch him during school hours. It was hard leaving him, but Emma needed the intellectual stimulation of teaching, and they needed her income to supplement Henry's still-growing business. Life continued, busy and full. James grew into a toddler, then a small boy, curious and energetic. Emma got pregnant again when James was 3, and their daughter Margaret was born in the spring of 1888. 2 years later came another son, Thomas, named for Henry's old mentor in St. Louis. The house Henry had built expanded as their family grew. He added rooms, a larger kitchen, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. He built beds and desks for the children, a larger dining table, bookshelves for Emma's constantly growing collection of books. Each piece of furniture was crafted with the same care he'd put into that first chair, built to last and to serve the people he loved. Emma stopped teaching when Thomas was born, finding that 3 children under 6 was more than she could manage alongside a classroom full of students. She missed it sometimes, missed the satisfaction of watching children learn, but she'd trained her replacement well and stayed involved with the school board. And she found new satisfaction in raising her own children, teaching them to read and calculate and question the world around them. The years passed quickly, full of the small joys and challenges of family life. James grew tall and serious, showing an aptitude for working with his hands like his father. Margaret was bright and determined, reminding everyone of her mother. Thomas was the wild one, always getting into trouble, always pushing boundaries, but with a sweet heart underneath the mischief. Through it all, the chair remained a constant presence in their bedroom. Emma and Henry would sometimes sit in it together in the evenings after the children were asleep, Emma leaning back against Henry's chest, his arms around her, both of them marveling at the life they'd built. "You ever miss it?" Henry asked one such evening. "The wandering, the freedom, going wherever you wanted." Emma considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the adventure of it," she admitted, "the feeling that anything could happen, but I don't miss the loneliness. And I'd trade all the adventure in the world for this, for you and the children and our home." "I feel the same," Henry said. "Though I never knew how lonely I was until I met you. I thought I was content moving from place to place, but I was just surviving. This is living." In 1895, when James was 10, Margaret 8, and Thomas 5, Stein's Pass experienced a period of rapid growth. The railroad expanded its operations, bringing more people and more opportunities. Henry's carpentry business thrived, and he hired 2 apprentices to help with the demand. Emma returned to teaching part-time, taking over the older students while a younger teacher handled the primary grades. They prospered in ways neither of them had imagined possible during those early lonely years. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable, respected members of a thriving community. Henry served on the town council. Emma helped establish a lending library. Their children attended the school where Emma had once taught, growing healthy and strong. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Emma and Henry celebrated their 15th anniversary. Their children were teenagers and near teenagers now. James 17 and already working alongside his father, Margaret 15, and talking about becoming a teacher herself, Thomas 10, and still wild but showing signs of settling. On their anniversary evening, after a family dinner, and after the children had gone to bed, Henry and Emma sat together in the chair that had started everything. It was showing its age now, the finish worn where Emma's hands had gripped the armrests, the cushions compressed from years of use. But it was still sturdy, still comfortable, still perfectly suited to its purpose. "I should refinish this," Henry said, running his hand over the worn armrest. "Make it new again." "Don't," Emma said. "I like it exactly as it is. Every worn spot, every mark, they're all part of our story." Henry kissed her temple. "I built this chair in a stable, working by lantern light, trying to solve a problem for a woman I barely knew. And I sat against a wall in pain, thinking I'd always be alone," Emma added. "We've come a long way." "We have," Henry agreed. "And I'd do it all again, every bit of it, just to end up right here with you." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other at the right moment, who'd chosen each other every day since, who'd built a life together from nothing but love and determination, and the simple kindness of a chair built for someone in need. The children grew and eventually left home. James took over Henry's carpentry business, marrying a local girl and building his own house just down the street. Margaret became a teacher as she'd planned, eventually taking a position in Las Cruces and marrying a bank clerk. Thomas, their wild one, surprised everyone by becoming a lawman, serving as deputy sheriff and eventually sheriff of the county. Henry and Emma aged together, their hair graying, their hands becoming less steady but no less capable. Henry continued to build furniture well into his 60s, creating pieces that people treasured and passed down through generations. Emma continued to read voraciously, to mentor young teachers, to be a pillar of the community she'd once entered as a broken stranger. And through all the years, through all the changes, the chair remained. It sat in their bedroom, a permanent fixture, used sometimes for reading, sometimes for nursing grandchildren when they came to visit, sometimes just as a place to sit and remember when they'd been young and lonely and finding their way to each other. On a spring evening in 1920, when Henry was 69 and Emma 61, they sat together in the chair one last time. Henry's health had been failing, his heart giving out slowly, and they both knew the end was coming soon. The doctor had suggested he stay in bed, but Henry had refused. He wanted to be in the chair he'd built all those years ago, wanted Emma in his arms one more time. "I have no regrets," Henry told her, his voice weak but steady. "Every choice I made, every place I went, it all led me to you. That makes it all worthwhile." Emma held his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I love you," she said. "I've loved you since you stood in Mrs. Patterson's boarding house and offered to build a chair for a stranger." "Not a stranger," Henry whispered. "You were never a stranger. The moment I saw you, I knew you were meant to be mine." He died that evening, peacefully, holding Emma's hand, sitting in the chair he'd built with love and skill 37 years earlier. Emma held him for a long time, crying quietly, grateful that they'd had so many years, grieving that those years were over. The funeral was large, attended by what seemed like half of southern New Mexico. Henry had touched many lives with his kindness and his craft, had built furniture that would outlast him by generations. But no one mourned him more than Emma, who'd lost not just her husband but her best friend, her partner, the person who'd seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. She stayed in the house they'd built together, surrounded by furniture Henry had made, by memories of their life. The children wanted her to move in with one of them, but she refused. This was her home, hers and Henry's, and she wasn't leaving it. She lived another 15 years, dying peacefully in her sleep at 76. When her children came to settle her estate, they found her in the bedroom, lying in the chair Henry had built, a peaceful expression on her face and a letter in her hand. It was Henry's letter from that morning he'd left for Texas, the one she'd read 100 times, the one she'd kept all those years. James took the chair, understanding what it meant, what it represented. It stayed in his family for generations, passed down along with the story of the cowboy who'd built it for a hurting woman and the love that had grown from that simple act of kindness. The chair that had been built to ease pain became a symbol of enduring love, proof that sometimes the right person appears at exactly the right moment, carrying exactly what you need, whether that's a piece of furniture or a second chance at happiness or simply the courage to hope again. And in Stein's Pass, New Mexico, where two lonely wanderers had found home in each other, the story of Emma Rollins and Henry Zimmerman became the kind of legend that gets told on warm evenings, when children ask their grandparents about true love, and old folks smile and remember that sometimes all it takes is someone who sees your pain and decides to help, who builds you something with their own hands, and in doing so builds a future neither of you imagined possible. The chair, worn and treasured, stood as testament to the truth that love often begins not with grand gestures or perfect timing, but with simple kindness, with seeing someone else's suffering and choosing to do something about it, with building something meant to help and discovering in the process that you've built something far greater than you intended. Henry Zimmerman had built a chair for a woman who couldn't sleep lying down, and in doing so, he'd built a life, a family, a love story that would endure long after both of them were gone, carried forward in the memories of their children and grandchildren, and in the sturdy wood of a chair that had held them both through pain and joy, through lonely nights and peaceful years, through everything that mattered most.